Coming up next on Insights on PBS Hawaii, a look ahead where we're headed after the general election. Aloha and welcome to Insights. I'm Daryl Huff with Hawaii News Now for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Tonight on Insights, we'll talk to political analysts about how the results of election 2014 will affect our lives. Hawaii has a new governor, an all-Democrat contingent in a Republican Congress, and on Maui, a rare voter initiative is headed for the courts. What do the results of election 2014 mean for Hawaii's future? We invite you to join our conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments. Now to our panel. Colin Moore is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Chad Blair is a veteran Hawaii reporter who covers politics for Honolulu Civil Beat. And Debora Halbert, a first-time guest on our show, is an associate professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and chairwoman of the Department of Political Science. Now, one of the big stories, the most exciting things, it was amazing, $8 million spent on a county initiative over GMO, and the people who spent the money lost. Colin, what's the moral of this story?
I mean, first, it's that money doesn't buy elections. I mean, clearly, Monsanto and Dow were very worried about this setting a precedent, perhaps inspiring other areas around the country, not only here, but throughout the nation, to try this strategy. And there was a tremendous mobilization for this issue. I mean, one thing we do know from the research is that the most effective way still to win elections is to go door to door, to talk to your friends and neighbors, and Maui is small enough where you can do that. You might not have been able to pull this off in California, but in Maui County you could. And I think the anti-GMO folks did a tremendous job mobilizing their constituency. I think it was made up of a lot of, sometimes I think progressive voters who sometimes felt disconnected from the mainstream Democratic Party, but in this case, you know, I think this was a grassroots effort, and I think we'll be dissecting this campaign over the next couple of months.
Chad, do you think that the money actually may have backfired and the amount of advertising may have backfired against the big GMO companies?
Well, let's be clear. There's no way Monsanto is going to stop spending money to advocate for GMO. I mean, it was a setback. Remember, it was what, 50 to 48% in the final analysis. And remember as well, not all of Maui County voted the same way. On Molokai, where biotech is a big employer, I think perhaps the largest, more people on Molokai voted against that initiative than for it. But in terms of your question as to whether, I mean, I like to think it's always great when the big spender, I mean, look at Neil Abercrombie, he was the big spender in the primary and so forth, but it's not going to change our spending policies on politics.
Debora, let me ask you, what did you think of that whole campaign? It must have been fascinating to watch from an academic point of view.
Well, it's interesting on a lot of levels. I think in terms of the money, you did see a turn after the disclosure information came out about how much they had spent, and I think that the people that were very much for the temporary ban on GMOs there used that to their benefit, because there was quite a bit of publicity about how much they spent. And really that initiative isn't just about GMOs, it's about the future of agriculture in Hawaii. And so there's a lot of layers and complexities to, I think, what's happening there. And so it is about Monsanto and is about multinational corporations and the way that they use experimental seeds on Maui, but it's also a little bit about how we want agriculture to be shaped in the future.
Colin, on that same point about these big agro companies, Hawaii was seen as sort of a beachhead, but in other states they've had this similar initiatives and the opposite outcomes.
Yeah, well, I think that's why we expected this to fail. I think I certainly did, and given the first couple of printouts, it looked like that was what was going to happen. But I think Debbie is right, that this also touched on some issues that are very, very sensitive to people in this state, the future of agriculture, and where there's already a constituency that pays very close attention to that. So that makes part explain why this was successful here and not in other places.
Chad, you know, there were scare tactics on both sides of this one. How do you think about the quality of the campaign? Do you think it was a high-level kind of thing, or was it pretty much down and dirty?
Well, look, we've seen the GMO battle first on Kauai, and of course that's being litigated, and then we've seen it on the Big Island, and that's being litigated, and that's going to happen on Maui. It already is, according to Dow and Monsanto. But the real root problem with the GMO issue is the folks that think it's safe and the folks that think it's not safe. There is no middle ground. There is no agreement. They have all their different science, their different reports. And I don't know whether you can find a way to compromise on something that people find acceptable. Will it be labeling? I think most of us feel it's good to regulate pesticides. If you're going to be near schools, maybe we ought to know what's in those pesticides. Maybe you shouldn't be spraying next to schools. I mean, these are common sense things. But there is no consensus. These groups hate each other. Look at the social media campaign. They do not trust each other in any way.
You know, Deborah, now that it's law, it's going to force probably the legislature to act. What do you see happening next?
Well, besides the lawsuits, there are these issues of federal preemption and state preemption, and because counties unfortunately have the least sovereignty of any of the different political layers, those things need to be discussed. And so if these things go through the courts the way they probably will in terms of state preemption, it does have to happen at the state level. And I think you will see these issues coming before the next ledge.
You know, in fact, our legislature has a history of trying to either preempt or overturn court rulings, particularly on environmental issues. So, Colin, do you think that you're going to see a real rapid response by the legislature, or do you think they'll hold back and wait and see?
Well, they may hold back. I say that because this was an initiative. This is really the will of the people. It would be, there was going to be some serious pushback if it looks like they're trying to legislate this issue from Honolulu.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I want to add something. The Senate just reorganized yesterday, and there was a new chairman of the Agricultural Committee, Russell Ruderman from the Big Island, and he's very much anti-GMO. He simply doesn't think it's safe. He replaces Clarence Nishihara, who is someone who received a whole heck of a lot of money from the biotech companies. So I think there could be a change. Having said that, Ag is not the only committee that you got to get through. I think Roz Baker's on consumer protection and commerce. And in terms of the federal level, the whole problem with labeling is, one argument is that it's got to go through the Commerce Department, that it really cannot be done, even though we like to have home rule. This is a federal system that we operate under.
Just to move the discussion a little bit, Colin mentioned this was an initiative, this was the public will. Hawaii's constitution doesn't allow initiative on a state level, unlike many other states. Right. Deborah, what do you think? Do you think that people will start to clamor for this ability to have a little more direct democracy in Hawaii?
That didn't go very far, I guess, in the last permutation of it. And I'm not sure. It would be, given the voter turnout, it's hard to know what the people of Hawaii would really say in terms of more direct democracy. But I would be optimistic that they would want to push forward different kinds of initiatives.
Do you think the direct democracy initiative would increase voter turnout?
It's hard to say if it would or not. I'm not sure that I have an answer for that one.
Chad,
I would just add that initiative, referendum, and recall have been proposed at our legislature time and time again, usually from Republican legislators, ironically enough. I know, Sam Sloan in particular, exactly. But again and again, we are just not going for this. I do think that the GMO initiative shows the power of people when they want to come together. I mean, they beat the big guys, at least so far, until the big guys come in with their lawyers.
Well, even if they come in with their lawyers, they still have this major victory.
It's really an amazing thing, and makes people stop and think fundamentally, what is democracy about? It really is about what we get to do, not always what our leaders tell us to do.
Colin, what do you think about the idea of, and I brought this up at another panel when we were talking about turnout, is do you think that direct democracy is something that Hawaii is ready for? It's a very paternal system we have here that says, oh, the people can't handle this kind of power.
Well, so I actually don't think the initiative and referendum system works particularly well. I mean, if you look at California, there have been some seriously bad legislation passed as a result of that system. It's not the case that it means that that interest groups lose power in the initiative system. In some cases, they can have tremendous power. Because they can put issues on the ballot, they can advocate for those issues. So I actually don't think that the initiative system really creates good public policy. I mean, I actually think it is better to go through the representative system.
Okay, let's have some fun now. We can play Monday morning quarterback with the governor's race. So let me start with you, Chad. You know, David Ige, he came from worst to first. You know, and what do you think about how he conducted his campaign? You know, what were the major factors that led to him coming from behind and winning this one?
Certainly very clean. I never saw him go negative. He certainly attacked.
He didn't have to go negative. There were people doing that for him.
Well, sure. Definitely in the general election, all that money from the RGA and the DGA against Iona, against Ige, and so forth. But he was very consistent throughout. Continually attacked Governor Abercrombie, particularly on his leadership style, saying people did not like the way that they were not listening to the people was his main argument. And as he went around the islands, that's what people were telling him. And he said somewhere along the way he could just sense that people were actually showing up because they wanted to show up, not because like a union called him and said, you got to go and sign wave.
Beyond the primary to the general, though, I mean, what happened that suddenly made David Ige a real candidate and ultimately popular candidate?
You know, I'll have to admit, it's still a bit of a mystery to me because I know the man through watching him in the legislature, particularly in Ways and Means. I mean, let's face it, he is not the most charismatic person. He is not someone, I mean, look at Neil Abercrombie. There's nobody that gives a speech like Neil Abercrombie. I have a feeling they found that.
Some people don't think that's a really good thing.
Well, clearly that was the case in the primary, and I think people found his quiet, calm competence to be appealing, particularly in contrast to Neil Abercrombie. In terms of the general election, boy, very different candidates on the stand there. And I think someone like Mufi Hanneman did so well during the debates, and yet Ige managed to just stay consistent. And even though he didn't break 50%, I'd say that was a landslide.
You know, let me ask you this, Deborah. You know, Chad mentioned Mufi Hanneman. I think that a lot of people agree that Mufi Hanneman was probably the best qualified of the three candidates. Why do you think he lost?
As a third-party candidate, it's oftentimes difficult. I mean, one of the things Ige has going for him is he has the power of the Democratic Party behind him, right? As well as Iona having the power of the Republican Party, and that doesn't leave a lot of ground for a third-party candidate or a fourth-party candidate. For example, we had a Libertarian candidate as well who got very little press for his election bid. So there's some of that, I think. There's also some that I think he came across perhaps as a one-issue voter, as a one-issue candidate, as somebody who really is intervening in a campaign perhaps that there were already enough players within.
He was a spoiler in many ways.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this. I'll pass this one to Colin. I mean, in the end, was he a spoiler, or ultimately was he irrelevant? I mean,
who is he drawing votes from? I mean, I think he drew from both sides. I mean, and Debbie is exactly right. As a third-party candidate, you don't have no infrastructure to help you win. I mean, you don't have automatic endorsements from the unions or from churches, and so it's very hard. Plus, people knew who Mufi was going into that. I mean, that both helped and hurt him. But they already had a preconceived notion of what this guy was all about. So even though he did well in the debates, I don't know if that really changed a whole lot of people's opinion about him.
Where do you think he's going to go from here?
Well, gosh, I have tried to read what Mufi Hanneman's going to do many times before, and I've been wrong usually every single time. Think about it, though. This is his fourth run for high office, 2 times for Congress and 2 times for governor. And he's, 0-3 just in the last few years alone. I don't know how you do it. But you could tell on election night, he actually likes this. He likes campaigning. He does. He likes meeting people. He definitely is committed to public service. And far and away, he was the most experienced and best candidate out there of all. I don't know how he does it. But I wouldn't be surprised if we've seen the last of him.
Let me go back to a historic factor here, in that, and Richard Barreca from the Star Advertiser used the term the Holy Trinity.
That's right. That's a great term. I like that.
The AJAs, the elderly, and the unions. Do you think basically that's the troika of elements that's going to hold power in this state for the foreseeable future?
Sure. I mean, as long as voter turnout remains low, those are the 3 most consistent groups to turn out to support their candidates. And so they supported Takai, they supported Ige. I mean, we've talked a bit about how voter turnout continues to decline, but elderly voters here, they still turn out to vote. Union voters still turn out to vote. Japanese Americans vote at the highest rates of anyone in this state. So as long as other voters are not mobilized in the same way, they're still going to exercise tremendous power.
But remember, those numbers are all declining as well.
That's right.
Japanese American population is shrinking. Labor clout is not what it used to be. And even though the young will become the old, there are a different batch of voters with different views, and they don't always follow their predecessors.
Right. So let me ask Deborah a little bit about Duke Iona now. Started off strong, he was ahead in the early polls, but as soon as Neil Abercrombie was out, it's sort of like he faded away from people's interest. And what do you think he should have done differently? If you were his campaign advisor back a year ago, how would you have set him up?
Well, it is always ambitious, I think, to be a Republican running in this state and trying to determine how to best formulate your agenda, because you can't align yourself too closely to what is happening at the national level, because that doesn't play in Hawaii very well at all. But you can't become too much like the Democrats, otherwise you haven't established sufficient justification for why you ought to be the person to win. So it's a tough line here, I think, more so than in most states. And so what I would probably, and I don't know, again, if this would be good or bad advice, but I would probably try to say head to the middle as opposed to what happens at the national level, which doesn't seem to be heading towards the middle at all.
I think that's what Richard Nixon used to say. You run in the primaries to the right, and then
Yes.
you run back to the middle for the...
And certainly there were moments in time where people were saying perhaps he's too connected to some of the mainland politicians and the different kinds of ideals of the Republican Party there.
Well, look, I think there's this myth that we sometimes perpetuate that if the Republicans had just done something different, if they just had slightly better candidates, then they'd win. But Debbie's right. I mean, the fundamentals are very much against you. At the end of the day, this is a democratic state. People vote according to their party ID. I mean, maybe Iona could have done better if he mobilized the folks who are against SB1. He did a bit of that, but he ran away from it. Yeah, same-sex marriage amendment. But he kind of ran away from it a little bit in the general election, I thought. That may be why a lot of those folks didn't turn out to vote. I thought Charles Dejoux ran a great campaign, but he ran a great campaign before when he lost. I don't know what more the Republicans could do to win statewide office.
Ted, what do you think?
Well, they got to be shaking their heads. You know, I haven't finished my Wall Street Journals and New York Times, all the next election analysis, but my God, what a sweep for the Republicans nationally, and it is very demoralizing if you're a Democrat. And yet here, the Republican Party must wake up and go, how on earth can we not seem to make any inroads here? I will say this, Duke Iona was a better candidate than he was 4 years ago. He had a much more focused campaign. He's a very personable guy. He's quite good on the stump. He's really good at remembering people's names, which is like the main thing you need to do as a politician. And he actually had a couple of good ideas that he introduced as well. And he did not bad, actually, if you think about it. Came in within 12. I wonder how things would have been different if Mufi had not been in the race, and those 12 percentage points would have been at play. My sense is more of it would have gone to Duke Iona.
Let me ask you about... Oh, sorry.
I wonder also what would have happened if he'd been running against Abercrombie.
Well, yeah.
Because...
No, that's a good point. I said on this program when someone called in, do you think there was a crossover vote during the primary? And I said, oh, no, there's no way. Well, I was wrong. Our pollster said, in fact, there was a sizable number of people that voted for Ige because they thought he would be the weaker candidate in the general election. Folks that were supporting Iona and Hanneman, and in fact, Ige turned out to be the stronger candidate.
You know, Deborah, the thing that strikes me is that early on, he had the opportunity of choosing his running mate, and he chose a New Hope Church pastor, very well known. Do you think that was the right thing to do? You mentioned, waffling somewhat on the conservative values. You know, it's sort of like, I've got this guy, but I'm not going to talk about why I got that guy.
Well, running mates can play, I guess, a supportive role or a detrimental role, and that would certainly be true for many of the different kinds of candidates we've seen. I think that way, choosing a running mate like that gives you a way of saying to the people who vote for those conservative values that you aren't ignoring them.
I would just also say he didn't choose Elwin Ahu. Elwin had a primary against Kimo Sutton, and Ahu won. But when the two of them became a running mate, a team, Duke Iona, who's Catholic and very socially conservative, and Elwin Ahu is a New Hope pastor. They had their own holy trinity, if you will, that they were working on, but the turnout did not materialize. The anger for the same-sex marriage vote, let the people decide, let the people vote. It did not turn out in registration, and did not turn out in turnout. Turnout. In
the end, there was really only one candidate who's told us that she was inspired by SB1. That actually won, and that was Andrea Tupola, and that was against the damaged incumbent.
Who voted against same-sex marriage.
Right. It was a damaged
and this was, a result of these campaign finance issues. I mean, think of some of those races. Like Chris Lee, I know, was worried about his seat on the windward side. It turns out there was really no problem.
Wasn't close at all.
Yeah, it wasn't close at all.
One question from our audience, and I always want to honor them. What effect did the unions paying their members to vote have on the election? Is that just a myth?
Do unions pay the
Yes,
members I
don't.
Members paid the
You guys
unions.
are UPA, right?
I certainly was not paid to do anything. But I do think the unions played a role here, obviously. I mean, I think one place you do see this pretty clearly is in the amendment about pre-K.
Number 4.
Number 4, exactly. I mean, voter turnout was low. HSTA was opposed to this. Of course, EGA was opposed to this, too.
Because they endorsed it.
Right. But I do think that played a role there. I mean, the folks who supported pre-K, it was younger voters, voters with families, people who didn't tend to turn out to vote. So in that case, I think HSTA did play a major role in that.
The Hawaii News Now poll actually did break that down, and it was very clear that people who really had an immediate need for preschool were the ones who were supporting it, and the folks that were older, more affluent, were against it. And that's exactly how the vote skewed, right? Another question that I've got here I'll just do this because I'm trying to be brave here. P.S. for Daryl, how much money did the TV stations make on all the political advertising?
Tons.
Everybody who was in the advertising business made a lot of money off of this campaign, no question about it. But that certainly wasn't our motivation for covering politics. What role did the New Hope Church play in the campaign of Duke Aiona? Did you guys observe anything in particular?
Not nearly as great as one expected.
Yeah.
I did go to a function at the Blaisdell when Duke and Elwyn were there, and it was essentially a revival. Bible meeting, people singing, praising God, and so forth, and then they also talk politics. I do think that there's something still there that is being underestimated, and that those numbers are growing, evangelicism in particular, along with the presence of the Catholic Church here and the Mormon Church. It just did not manifest itself in terms of votes.
Yeah, those voters, those socially conservative voters, I suspect that the ones who tend to vote turned out for this election. The ones who didn't turn out. I mean, it didn't really have the effect of bringing in voters who otherwise wouldn't have voted into the electorate, which I was a bit surprised about, to be honest. I thought there would have been a little more action there.
Let's look ahead a little bit. Deborah, Chad made a reference to he was surprised to see David Ige develop as a candidate quite as much as he did, but he's now going to have to develop as a governor. And in the next is a very short time until he's going to have a cabinet in place and a budget in place. What are you looking for in the next 2 or 3 weeks that are going to show that he can exert the kind of leadership that we need in a governor?
Well, he's certainly positioned well because he already knows basically the entire infrastructure and he knows all of the different players. So I think that he won't have much trouble making that transition. What I would like to see is a sort of shift from the pragmatist that he is, and he certainly ran a very pragmatic campaign in terms of issues, and to think a little bit more about the broader vision that he would like to see as governor for the next 4 years in terms of the state as a whole, because I think that that's a layer of the leadership that would be really helpful.
Chad, you made the remark about, let's see if he can be a governor. What do you think?
I tell you this. He does have an inner strength, almost a steel spine. I thought that maybe he'd be a pushover, but in fact, I talked to his colleagues in the Senate and folks in the House as well, and he won't budge. When he thinks he's right, he will listen to everybody. He is open to ideas, but when he comes down to a decision, he's firm. And I saw that in budget negotiations with the House. So that could be a very, very strong characteristic as governor. He has his first press conference tomorrow, actually, in which he's probably going to name some cabinet positions. Wouldn't be surprised if he kept a few people from the Abercrombie administration. We'll see, but he may end up surprising us.
A little bit of inside baseball. We've been pushing to get an interview, and he didn't really make himself available the day after the election, and now we're 2 days out. He still really didn't make himself available for questions, and he's now going to hold a press conference. Colin, what do you think is going on there?
Well, I mean, I think maybe he wants to figure out what his vision is or what he wants to say to the press. I mean, the other thing I want to add...
He actually wants to think about what he's going to say?
Shockingly. But one hallmark from his campaign, and we'll see if he can manage this when he's governor, because, the executive and legislature are sort of set up naturally to have, be in a bit of a feud. But his claim when he was a candidate was that he knows everyone in the legislature. He works well with them. This is no drama Ige. He's not going to get in fights with the ledge like Abercrombie did. And we'll see if he can actually manage to make that happen when he's governor, when he has to be stubborn and really oppose his former colleagues.
Daryl, you know, he might just be getting some sleep.
Yeah, well, that's true, too. I'm sure he's exhausted.
You remember, I think it was your TV station in which he started answering a question during the debate and then said, what was the question again? I mean, that thing, he's been running this campaign since last summer, I believe, and he's exhausted. And remember, the other guys didn't have a contested primary. He did.
And not an easy one.
No, not an easy one.
It ended up being easy, but it wasn't at the time. Let's move on to the congressional race. I think we've got about 5 minutes, but we can go through our break in a little bit. We thought this was going to be close. I mean, Colin, what happened?
Well, first, I mean, I don't think turnout was what DeJoux expected. You could see the disappointment on his face when he gave that concession speech. I mean, the guy who's always so enthusiastic about everything just looked completely exhausted and defeated. So I think, you know, Bareka's, what was it, the Holy Trinity turned out. I think DeJoux was really hoping for more turnout, maybe from folks motivated by SB1, perhaps people tired of mainstream Democrats who might have bought his story that Hawaii really did need a member of the majority caucus. But that didn't happen. So, I mean, I guess the surprising thing was that he was polling so well. It's not surprising that he lost.
And by the way, it wasn't a blowout.
No,
it was only a couple of percentage
exactly.
points, and I can't remember the exact count, but maybe 6,000 or 7,000 votes. I mean, he was much closer to Takai than he was in his losses to Colleen Hanabusa.
But he didn't get nearly as many votes as he got against Hanabusa.
I know, but look at our turnout rate, completely dropped.
But Chad is exactly right. He did remarkably well.
Well, I mean, this is the other thing that we looked at, and you know, I'm sure that you're familiar with the way things are reapportioned to the rest of the country. This district's lines were changed in the last reapportionment. Do you think that there was a deliberate effort to make this harder for Republicans to win? I'll put the hardest question to the newest member of our...
Reapportionment is used in that manner across the nation, and so it would be very surprising if some political maneuvering wasn't part of the reapportionment battle.
And then, Chad, can you describe what you think happened there?
Well, she's absolutely right about in other parts of the country, there's no question when Republican legislatures control drawing the boundaries. I don't think reapportionment was controlled by Democrats. We actually did a story where I even said, does Calvin Say control reapportionment? That's back when he was Speaker. You know, it was balanced, the number of people that were there. There were challenges, remember. I don't sense that it turned out. And think about this. They actually picked up a seat. The Republicans actually picked up a seat this time around. So I don't buy that it was a, if you will, an inside game there.
Well, let me just throw this at you, Colin, since I made everybody. Now, just to look at that district, it had to grow because of the way things worked, right? You had to get more voters in there. It's still smaller than the second district.
Oh, yeah.
But they pushed the line up to include Mililani and down to include Eva Beach, and then they took Makakilo out of it. What do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I really don't think that would have played a major role anyway. I mean, that district was already a heavily Democratic district.
I got to interject here. In fact, in Mililani, 2 Republicans are representing in the legislature, Beth Fukumoto Chang and Lauren Cheap Matsumoto. And Eva Beach down into close to Makakilo and Kapolei, there's a lot of Republican votes down there. What you have to do when you're doing reapportionment, it's a math game. You have to find a way to make it balance out. And you go where the population is, and it is in West Oahu.
Okay, let me ask the same question I asked about David Ige about Mark Takai. What, Deborah, are you going to be looking for in the next few weeks from him to show he's ready to step into Congress?
Well, again, there's always this transition period where you go from being a campaigner to being somebody who is a representative for the state. And so, much like for Ige, I would like to see that vision come forward about how when the representation part starts to happen, he will be representing the state and the key issues of our state to the nation.
He's not going to have a very fun job, let's be honest. Okay, he's joining a Congress where the Republicans have a huge majority. He's a freshman member. He's a freshman member of the minority party. I mean, he's not going to be able to do much of anything, and it's not because it's going to be Mark Takai's fault. It's because if you're a freshman member of the minority party, you just don't do much of it in the House of Representatives.
No, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard was the exception, and like Tulsi Gabbard, Mark Takai is a veteran, and I think that actually might help him in some ways. But Colin's absolutely right. I mean, they're just not going to be listening to, hey, can you do something for Hawaii?
Who are you?
You know, I have to ask a question, and This will be a quick one, and then we'll go to a break. We have heard a lot of accusations that the media in Hawaii is actually biased against the Republican Party. And it's a question that I wanted to ask because we did talk a lot about the troubles of the Republican Party. Do you feel that the media is fair to Republicans? Colin, let me start with you.
I think so. I mean, I think that I've not seen any tremendous media bias in favor of the Democrats, but the truth is that most of the people in the state are Democrats. I think people have that perception because there's a lot of reporting on Democrats in the state, but that's because the Democrats are in all the leadership positions. I mean, they have all the members of the congressional delegation. I think my own sense is that Charles DeJoux was treated relatively fairly by the media. I mean, Pat Saiki's certainly been on all of the TV shows, including this one, many times. I think my sense is that a lot of people in the media would actually like to see the Republican Party do a bit better. I think they'd like to see us move to have more of a competitive two-party system.
Debora, your thoughts on that?
Well, it's only perception, but I believe that the media does try its best to represent, have the Republican Party represented. And so you oftentimes have somebody from each party, even if that skews it because of the kinds of already existing Democratic power here.
Ask Neil Abercrombie if the local media is in the tank with Democrats, because the coverage of him was pretty tough. And I heard a lot of people from his campaign saying, oh, you guys are just not being fair to us. Look, the Republicans lost. Abercrombie lost. What do? You look for excuses. I agree with Colin. I agree with Debbie. I think the media really tries hard. That doesn't mean that we're perfect and that we couldn't improve, but we're just not in the business. I would love to see more Republicans. It'd be a lot more interesting at the legislature.
Okay, let's take a break for a moment. Tonight we're talking about Hawaii's future after election 2014. We invite you to join our conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments. Call 973-1000 on Oahu and 800-283-4847 from the neighbor islands. And on that note, let me grab a couple of cards right off the top here. Regarding the GMO initiative, someone wants us to explore that there is a lot more middle ground than we're giving them credit for. They feel like we've oversimplified this. What do you think are the essential elements of future GMO regulation? What do we really need to be debating in this state, as opposed to the safety or lack of safety of the GMO crop, which really isn't something for us to figure out?
Where is this middle ground of which this person speaks? I haven't seen it in the campaigns. I haven't seen it from the leadership of both sides. I can tell you that I would love to see middle ground as someone that likes to see compromise. That is the essence of government. I haven't noticed it. And I'll try and be more open-minded that perhaps that's the case. But having covered this now at the legislature for 2 sessions and then seeing what happened on Maui as well as the Kauai and the Big Island, I don't really see a kumbaya moment coming.
Colin, what do you think?
Well, look, I think this is already wrapped up in people's ideas about other things and their frustrations about other things. I mean, fears about these big companies, concern and protection about agriculture in Hawaii. I mean, I think people project a lot of other views onto the GMO issue, which is why I don't really think we're going to see a lot of compromise, because most people feel pretty passionately both ways who pay attention to this, and a whole lot of people don't pay any attention to it at all.
Debora, your thoughts about that?
It is difficult to see what that middle ground is. I think we could have a more nuanced debate about what a GMO is and the kinds of different experimental to regular products that we have. And the Maui piece of legislation does sort of reflect on that a little bit. So it may be that we could have a more nuanced conversation about what GMOs are.
I will just add one thing about this. It fundamentally is about health, and that's something that all of us care about. And what the Maui plan is asked for is a study. It asked the county, with I think support from the biotech companies, to do a study and then find out whether it's harmful or not. Well, I think you're going to see those same sides coming out again. But fundamentally, this is about wanting to breathe and live and know that we're feeding our kids good food.
I guess the question becomes, and what the writer of this question offered is that they both want to know if the chemicals are safe. Not necessarily the food, but the chemicals. Is there something that the legislature could do to throw a little cool water on this to calm things down by dealing more directly with the threat of overuse of pesticides, for example, or regulation of pesticides? Debora,
which is slightly different than regulating GMOs themselves. And so it might be worthwhile to separate those two issues out, because it was mixed on in the Kauai case as well. And certainly GMOs facilitate a certain kind of pesticide use. But as many people probably would argue, you can use a variety of other kinds of non-GMO products and still have pesticide problem. So if that's the issue, it is a separate one. I don't know then if you were to address the pesticide issue, what the GMO folks would do. And I think that there are still intrinsic concerns about how we shape agriculture using those kinds of products that would need to be discussed.
Colin, anything?
Well, look, I mean, so there's two questions here. There's a policy question and a politics question, and I agree with there's a lot of room for nuance in terms of policy, in terms of studies, but I think in terms of the politics of this, no matter what this study comes out with, folks have already made up their mind about this. They feel passionately both ways. I mean, this touches on two things that people, really get at people's hearts, right? Health and jobs.
Oh, that's the other component.
Yeah.
I mean, what's going to happen? Imagine Maui County comes back a year from now. Hey, they're okay. No problem. You think people are going to buy that?
Exactly.
Well, probably half of them will and half of them won't.
Okay, talk about intransigent and unsolvable problems. Let's talk about Washington.
What a segue, Daryl.
Thank you very much.
From GMOs to DC.
Well, there's sometimes people it looks the same. Right now, as you folks have both all mentioned already, the Senate is now in Republican control. The House is firmly in Republican control. What's our delegation to do? What are they going to do? How are we? Is our state is seriously in some jeopardy from this state of affairs? Let me start with you, Colin.
Well, I mean, are we in serious jeopardy? No. I mean, there's a lot of, we're very dependent on federal spending, of course, but it's not as if the military is going to be pulling out of Hawaii anytime soon. A lot of that federal spending will continue. But to the extent, we're going to have trouble with smaller things, getting appropriations for things like the East-West Center, yes. I mean, I hope that our congressional delegation can work behind the scenes a little bit, perhaps even develop some relationships with the Republican leadership. But it is hard to get that kind of money back when you're in the minority, when the party controlling Congress is deeply conservative. I mean, what reason do they really have to work with, in our case, relatively junior Democrats?
Well, yeah, Deborah, what do you think about that?
I think one of the things Brian Schatz tried to do initially, or has been doing, is to work in a bipartisan manner on the Hill. And so he brings that interest back with him. And so I agree with Colin that there's probably not a lot you can do when you're the minority party, but you can begin to build coalitions and you can begin to think about how you will deal with issues if and when the Democrats were to take control again.
I did ask Schatz this question on election night, and I said, well, what are you going to do? Is Hawaii in trouble? And he said, look, I already started reaching out to people. He knows Mitch McConnell. Yeah. He knows the Republicans that are in there. And there's only 100 senators, and it is about relationships. He mentioned appropriations, too. They're not going to cut defense for Pearl Harbor and so forth. He also said maybe we ought to focus on transportation and then maybe national parks and other things. But remember this, we're not just a junior delegation. Takai hasn't even been sworn in yet. Brian has been there for 2 years. Tulsi's been there for 2 years. And Maisie, even though she served in the House, has only been in the Senate for 2 years. Dan Inouye and Dan Akaka were in their 80s. And there's no more appropriations. It wasn't like Dan Inouye could call Ted Stevens and say, hey, can you make sure that we take care of Hawaii?
Well, the churn now, though, in Congress is a lot more than it used to be. The turnover is a little bit faster. I don't know that we're going to see people that survive 35, 40, 50 years anymore. But how long do you think, realistically, Colin, let me try this on you. How long do you think it'll take before we've got some traction, got some clout?
Well, I mean, probably Schatz will have to serve at least, finish out Inouye's term, serve another term, and then he'd have some seniority. I don't know what he will return as in terms of the Senate seniority, maybe in the high 70s.
Well, he wasn't identified as a freshman in the stories I've seen about freshmen, so he's...
No, he made it in the last few days before that Congress was sworn in, right? But... seniority is very important, but have you noticed our folks in the House have been leaving quickly? I mean, Colleen didn't stay very long, Maisie didn't stay very long, and even Neil left to come back and run for governor. And it's not just our delegates and in the House, because I agree, the Senate's where you want to be, that's the job to have. But people are leaving Congress, period, because they're just fed up of one, having to raise money all the time. That is becoming all-time consuming. I remember talking to Kai during the campaign. I'm making a lot of calls to people so I can ask for money. And the other thing is, it's just not very pleasant to be. Even Tulsi Gabbard has said, it's not a happy place to be right now.
Deborah, what do you think about, what is we talk about making bipartisan connections. Do you think a small state connection is a likely sort of coalition? You reach out to other people in other small states who basically are getting gored for money?
Well, I guess you could try that. I mean, there's certainly a nice connection between Hawaii and Alaska already. Many people travel back and forth. The West Coast also has some fairly small delegations, minus California, of course, that you could look at forming even a regional coalition of some kind. That we have a very new delegation, as has already been said, and so they may need to rethink how we do politics from Hawaii.
Let me throw one question out that I find interesting, and because you know, I worked in the Senate a long time ago, and it was a lot more collegial. And one of the things that people have told me that changed the most was that almost everyone goes home for the weekends. And so they don't have that life.
That was Gingrich, right?
Yeah, Gingrich in '94 started this. He told all the freshmen elected in that Republican Revolution, stay in the district. I mean, this was when people really started to run against Congress as an institution, which in part explains why it's so deeply unpopular. And I think this has a lot to do with it. You don't have these personal connections that you used to. I mean, Mark Takai, I think his family is staying here. I know Brian Schatz's family is staying here.
That's exactly my question.
It's a 10-and-a-half-hour flight.
You were saying that they're going to come back on the weekends. I mean, how tenable is that? I mean, is that an issue? I mean, is that concern people?
You know, they only vote
members are
on
going back
Tuesday,
and forth?
Wednesday, and Thursdays. They pretty much have Monday and Friday, depending on what the issue is, of course. And they're on recess so much of the time right now. Good God, what are they going to get done after when they go back to Washington right now?
Well, it's a good thing they're mostly young now, our guys. So I couldn't do that.
Or a 10-hour flight.
But there's a question about whether or not that really is a good decision. I mean, the electorate likes it. They like the idea that their representatives are staying close to the district. But it might be more valuable to stay in Washington to make those connections with other members.
Okay, now back to a question that I'm going back to, because we've got a couple of people now who've called in talking about party again, talking about the Republican Party, and I get the sense these are people who are unhappy that the Democratic majority is so firm here. Does the panel think that the voting majority in Hawaii, the voting majority of people in Hawaii, is happy with one-party rule? We truly do have one-party rule. I mean, is that what people said in this vote, that they're happy with that?
Well, if you think about it, nothing changed, with the exception of picking up that one seat in the House for Republicans. It's almost
two.
Well, that's because, remember, the person who ran, Richard Fale left, and then his seat stayed Republican. But now it's 43-8 rather than 44-7. I can't answer for people whether they're happy or not. You know, it is ironic. The economy's doing fairly well. Unemployment's low. Construction's booming. Tourism's moving along pretty good. Abercrombie didn't really have any scandal. And yet we pay the highest cost of living all across the board. We import our fuel. We import our food. I do think there's a sense of complacency. Maybe that's the word I would use.
What do you think it's going to take for the Republicans? We talked a little bit about this. You know, a great question from Upcountry Maui, which may be sort of an interesting question about the future. Please comment on how the change in demographics in Maui affected the GMO vote. Was there a particular part of the island, city versus rural, that favored the GMO restriction? And I kind of wonder if they're asking, you know, about, you know, Caucasian versus local also. You know, Hawaii is changing. We're more and more immigration. I mean, ultimately, does that bring potential for change?
Boy, it's when you get into race and things like that, you always got to be careful. But I'll go there. There's no question, immigration, particularly from places like California. Immigration, people moving from the mainland to here, and in many ways the environmental movement in Hawaii, it was also associated with the Native Hawaiian Renaissance and so forth, but there have been a lot of haole that have been instrumental, who have been leaders in that as well. I do think environmental issues cut across race and ethnicity, but there's no question that some of those folks coming from a very progressive state like California, you're from California, I think, it definitely has had an impact on our politics here.
So it's like more like, you think it's more likely that the change in demographics is going to lead to a more democratic?
Well, this is what I think is happening. And because we only have two parties, I think it actually hides a lot of the action of these factions within the Democratic Party. Now, of course, in post-Anoa'i Hawaii, I think there has been a little more room for a secondary faction.
Republicrats.
Well, there's the Republicrats, and then I think there's these more liberal progressives who care more about sort of post-materialist issues like the environment. GMOs is certainly part of that. And they have more of a voice. I mean, look at the race between Colleen Hanabusa and Brian Schatz. I mean, they were very close. There wasn't a lot of policy differences, but I do think Hanabusa represented the older New Deal, pro-union part of the Democratic Party, perhaps a bit more conservative, and Schatz was more progressive. He talked about environmental issues more.
Well, our congressional delegation is very progressive now, more than it was before.
More than it was before.
One person asked me, and I wrote this in, you know, are we done with the Dan Inouye era? That is, you know, Colleen Hanabusa did not win, although she didn't lose by much. And we've got this very progressive delegation. It probably would not be what Dan Inouye would advise. So what do you think?
Well, I think Colin is right about there being dimensions to the Democratic Party that maybe you don't see unless you go down to the State House and or follow a particular issue through the process. And at election time, it seems a lot more uniform than I think it does once these folks start debating things out. And so there is that level of it. I think that the Inouye era is ending. I don't think it's over, but I do think that the Schatz-Hanabusa race, as Colin said, really sort of symbolized a transition of sorts, and one that was from a way of seeing democratic politics as perhaps more controlled from a top-down way to one that does allow for some of these newer and I think more progressive voices. And so I think Chris Lee's candidacy is one of those symbols for
And
that.
Chad, do you think that we're becoming more ideological and less practical in our politics? And that maybe is what's leading to things like the big GMO thing, which is so...
Well, remember, it took us a long time to get same-sex marriage here. Remember, in '98, we actually banned, or rather limited marriage to one man and one woman. It's taken a while. A whole lot of other states went ahead of us, even though we were the ones that started in the courts. Look how long it took us to raise our minimum wage. That was one of the ballot issues that it was across the country, and I think a couple of states actually increased their minimum wage. Look at marijuana. We have not decriminalized that. I believe did Alaska and Oregon join this time around? Yeah. Death with dignity, physician-assisted suicide, another issue, progressive, I guess you could call it, has not materialized here. So there's still, to say the word Democrat, it's a small d, and it's not super liberal progressive. There are definitely pockets.
Yes.
You're right.
Okay, another change of subject based on wants of our listeners, which I think is great, mentions Keli'i Akina, who was probably a very high-profile candidate for OHA, the president of the Grassroots Institutes and so on. We saw money being spent on OHA. There was only one, in the end, there was only one incumbent displaced, and that was
Actually, no, because Oswald Stender retired, there was an opening. 3 incumbents were elected. That was Carmen Hulu Lindsay on Maui, and it was Rowena Akana and John Waihee IV.
Well, Peter Apo in the primary.
Peter Apo in the primary, so that makes 4 actually. Right. But there was an opening, and I believe Lei Ahu Isa defeated Mililani Trask and Keli'i Akina. The interesting thing about Akina, he has a PhD, he's Native Hawaiian. I believe he was the only candidate running for OHA that was against...
OHA.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well put. Well, and more specifically, against separating Hawaii, having an independent nation, dividing Hawaii. He just didn't believe in that at all. Still doesn't, I'm sure.
Yes, but comments on the Hawaiian vote, do you think that there was... we didn't talk much about it prior to the election, I think, but many people felt like, let's let the Hawaiians, you know, have that debate. But what do you think was going on there? Have you seen much to observe?
What happened with Keli'i Akina's, well...
Or just OHA in general?
I mean, this is an interesting thing about that part of the election, because I think there's a very large number of people, and this, of course, is reflected in the results, who feel that if they're not Hawaiian, they won't participate in OHA votes. So how that works itself out is, I mean, this is something I actually don't know a great deal about.
I have some sympathy to that, just because Rice Cayetano determined that all of us could vote. I mean, remember, these were statewide offices. Everybody in the state could vote on these things. In fact, OHA is at a very critical crossroads here. Not only do you have the enrollment for the Native Hawaiian Roll Commission, so you can start that independence movement. You have the Department of Interior that was here for all those heated hearings on recognition. And then there's OHA getting involved, wanting to develop Kaka'ako Makai. I mean, they have really been in the headlines a great deal. The settlement on ceded lands not long ago.
Ultimately, the vast majority of people didn't vote in that race.
I know, and yet those are all our issues, not just Hawaiian issues. But I do think there is some sensitivity there, some sense that I will stay out of this.
Deborah, what do you think about the future of the Hawaiian political scene?
In terms of OHA specifically, or in terms of
specifically, or moving into the next process of seeking recognition, or negotiating, or forming a kingdom?
Well, I find compelling some of the language of occupation, and I'm curious to see how that will play out. I would like to see the state itself take this issue up and debate it more seriously. I think that oftentimes it gets marginalized and it doesn't become part of the way we talk about politics in Hawaii. And everyone who comes here and learns through the University of Hawaii about the state of Hawaii and the former Kingdom of Hawaii is shocked typically. And I know that most tourists who come here are also shocked to find out this history. And so there's plenty still that needs to be done as that.
Although I would say, just like the GMO issue, there's not a little. Well, there is some more middle ground. There may be more middle ground.
Colin, your thoughts on this before we move on?
Well, I would agree with Debbie. I mean, I think this could be brought out and talked about more openly. I do think there's a sense when people bring it up that those folks are marginalized as radicals, and that's not always true. I think people have, even many non-Hawaiians have really nuanced views about this, and so I think this should become more of a mainstream topic of conversation.
Okay, good. A very important mainstream topic of conversation. I've been setting aside the cards on this issue, saving them up. All about turnout. You know, one of the reasons for low voter turnout is distrust of politicians that switch parties, like Mufi and Mike Gabbard is, I think they're referring to. Do you think that people here have any worse opinion of the political class than in other places? Deborah, let me ask you.
Boy, it'd have to be pretty bad.
Well, there's, obviously lots of reasons for low voter turnout. In terms of switching parties, I'm not sure. I guess you could look at that as another one of the many ways people see politicians in a cynical light, that it becomes more about them and not so much about a party platform.
Yeah, let me ask, though, just do you think that people here think less of politicians than think people in other places? I guess that's kind of what the question I'm trying to frame. Because I hear people from Boston or Chicago saying, "Oh, you think it's bad here," but there's a lot of people here that just don't trust politicians. They'll say that, and I'm just wondering if that's a fact.
I do think our geography and our small population do make a difference. We know our politicians, and with the incumbency rate, the return on. Nobody really lost besides Carolina Wana. I think we trust these people and their family. We know them very well. Unlike a state like California, where I think it's much more impersonal.
Colin, what do you think it would take to get more people to vote?
Boy, this is really the $64,000 question of Hawaii politics.
Let me throw one thing in. I don't mean to interrupt you, but we had an experience with the Hawaii News Now debate where we worked with your political science students, many of them yours as well, and that was very inspiring to see those young people very excited and interested. Do you think that that's going to ripple out, or do you think the young people are really the hard nut to crack when it comes to this?
Well, look, I'll tell you what the students said after that Hawaii News Now debate. Their questions were great, and they felt like the candidates didn't really give them good answers, give them thoughtful answers. I mean, this did not encourage my students to get involved in politics.
I'm so sorry about that.
Well, it's certainly not your fault. And this creates a vicious cycle, right? I mean, politicians love to talk a great game about how they want young people to get involved in the process and to vote, and they care about their issues, but young people don't vote, and so politicians don't much care about issues young people care about, and as a result of that, young people don't care about participating in politics. And I think that's the vicious cycle, and that's why you see our youth voter turnout still very, very low, although it's always lower everywhere. But our overall voter turnout, I mean, this is not something that changes by election, right? I mean, whether or not you vote is, you're socialized into that. People who are voters vote every time. And, maybe you're a little more excited. That's why you see it go up in the presidential election. But my concern for us is that we can, begin to enter this death spiral where people stop voting. You don't know anyone who votes. You don't have a social expectation to vote. You don't teach your children to vote. And it can just continue to get worse and worse. What I don't think is the problem.
Scary.
It is. I don't think the problem is that people don't like our local politicians. There's a reason people voted for the incumbents, and it's not just because, that's what they do. They know them. To get elected here, you have to knock on doors. You have to do the usual, cookouts and things like that.
Coffee hours. Stew and rice.
Deborah, what do you think, though, that of his comment, though, specifically about here the kids come to this debate all excited, they write their questions and they don't get answers. How do the politicians need to start answering some questions?
Yeah, Yes, well, I think that politicians who want to run for office through a campaigning process are very different perhaps than the kind we would want to govern after the election is over, because it takes a special kind of personality. Maybe Ige is an exception to that, but a special kind of personality to want to be out there going door to door and talking and raising money, which is, of course, the foundation of any campaign. And many, many people don't have the time or energy to do that, which means then you have candidates who fit this sort of, and are increasingly shaped through the advertising and the professionalization of campaigning to not say anything, right? And at that point, it just widens that gap between what people want to see and what they get.
Interesting.
Remember, we're also talking about poli-sci students, Daryl, and they're another category altogether. You know, you mentioned Ige and having the personality to run for office. Neil Abercrombie has the personality.
Right.
I don't think Ige made very much money at all during the primary.
Yeah, I think he's an exception, not the rule.
I agree. And come the general election, though, sure enough, he started having all these fundraisers, and I think he ended up raising well over $2 million.
He beat everybody.
He did, yeah. So he's, one could say he's learning to be a politician.
Real quick question. What about structural things like, we have a question here about vote by mail, where we are going to be making it easier to register on the day of a vote. Will those things make a difference?
They haven't dramatically, although the popularity of absentee ballots is definitely increasing, and that gives me some hope. I think the elections office even had a thing this year where you could drive by and register to vote. You do have same-day registration voting on elections coming in about 4 years, I believe. Did they pass online registration as well? I think they did as well. So certainly it will be easier than ever to vote, but whether that changes that mindset, as you say, you do what your family does, and you carry that on because you feel like that's what you do.
So, Debora, I haven't posted you on this question. What do you think would be the best way to increase turnout?
Well, there's the optimistic civic duty answer to that question, and being a political scientist, right, we oftentimes try to convince people that it is something that's important to do. Well, I teach constitutional law to undergraduates.
I have to say thank you. I've got to say thanks to all of you because I've run out of time. It's been a great panel. Next time on Insights, if you had a terminal illness, would you want to call the shots on how and when your life ends? Would you allow a loved one to dictate the terms of their death? In 2 weeks, Insights will ask the question, should we have the right to choose how we die? That's next time on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Daryl Huff. Ahui ho.